My husband said she was just a temporary assistant staying for a couple of weeks. 2 weeks stretched into 2 months, and then one day he flat out announced, "She has a right to be in this house, too." I thought the worst nightmare was being betrayed in the bedroom I designed. Then my billionaire father-in-law, a man famous for his boardroom ruthlessness, looked me in the eye and said, "My son-in-law made a huge mistake. I'll help you fix everything, in a way he'll never see coming." I realized that night, I didn't just lose a marriage. I figured out who was truly holding the knife, and it wasn't my husband. It was me, and his father. The evening the clock started ticking. It was pouring rain. Not the dramatic Hollywood downpour, but the kind of incessant, cold drizzle that makes the coastal suburbs of New England feel intensely lonely, even when you're supposed to be home. My name is Hannah Hall, and I was just shy of my 30th birthday, a professional interior architect who'd spent the last decade climbing out of the comfortable but constrained middle-class existence my parents had secured for me. I put the Hall in my name to remember where I came from, even after taking the Ward surname. This house, nestled just outside a city buzzing with old money and new tech, was my victory flag. I hadn't just bought it. I'd painstakingly gutted and redesigned every inch of it, from the shiplap in the mudroom to the custom-built floating shelves in the kitchen. It was my sanctuary, my portfolio, and the only truly solid thing in my 3-year marriage to Ethan Ward. Ethan, the sole heir to the Wardline Holdings empire, the only son of the notoriously ruthless billionaire Richard Ward, was charming, effortlessly handsome, and utterly accustomed to getting his way. Our marriage had always been a strange, cool contract. His father, Richard, had been polite at the wedding, his handshakes firm and dry, but he had never pretended to warm up to me. He kept his distance, treating me less like a daughter-in-law and more like a necessary background detail. He'd never publicly objected to our union, but he'd certainly never validated it. It was an arrangement where I was perpetually judged, always feeling the chilly glass ceiling of their world above me. I was finishing up a call with a client in the living room, the one I'd painted a deep, restful charcoal gray, when I heard the car pull up, followed by the sound of the garage door grinding open. Too soon. Ethan usually called. I opened the heavy oak front door just as he was fumbling with his keys in the mudroom. The air outside was thick with rain and salt, but the air that followed Ethan in was thick with something else, a sickening familiarity. Trailing behind him, radiating an almost insolent confidence, was a young woman, beautiful, of course, in a sleek, effortlessly put-together way that screamed money, even if she claimed she didn't have a place to stay. She was clutching a large, expensive suitcase that looked like it contained more than just a couple of weeks' worth of clothing. Ethan didn't kiss me or offer a simple apology for being late. He didn't even meet my eyes. He just gestured vaguely toward her, a smirk playing on his lips like this was some kind of elaborate joke he was pulling. "Hannah, this is Lena," he said, his tone utterly dismissive, as if introducing a new toaster oven. "She's my new executive assistant. Her apartment situation fell through, and she needs a place to crash for a couple of weeks. You know, until she gets sorted. Don't make a big deal out of it, all right?" He said it all in one breath, preemptively blaming me for the perfectly rational wave of nausea that was already hitting my stomach. Don't make a big deal out of it. The ultimate gaslight. Lena, meanwhile, didn't offer an apology or even a hesitant, polite smile. She stood there, letting the rain drip from her chestnut hair onto my polished hardwood floor, the floor I'd spent 2 weekends sanding myself. Her eyes weren't apologetic or embarrassed. They were observant, taking in the space with the casual ownership of someone who'd already been given the tour. I locked eyes with her for a split second. Most women caught in this situation, the awkward introduction to the wife, would offer a flicker of deference, a quick glance away. Not Lena. Her gaze was direct, utterly confident, almost daring. It was the look of someone who had long ago memorized the rhythm of Ethan's breathing, the exact way he ran his fingers through his hair when he was stressed. She wasn't an outsider being brought in. She was an inside player who was finally making her public debut. She knew things about him that I was supposed to know. I forced a tight smile, the one I usually reserved for my least favorite ward relatives at Christmas. "Welcome to our home, Lena. I hope your stay is brief." Ethan glared at me, but I didn't break. I simply walked into the kitchen and started reheating the roasted chicken I'd prepared. The familiar heat, a dull comfort against the cold creeping up my spine. Dinner was a slow-motion torture sequence. Lena sat across from me, radiating the kind of youthful energy that I, after a 10-hour workday, could only remember possessing. I watched. I didn't talk much. I didn't need to. I saw the way Ethan reached across the table, ostensibly for the salt, but his fingers grazed Lena's arm in a contact that lasted a moment too long. It was a ghost touch, subtle enough that if I called him out, he could say I was losing my mind. I watched as Lena started a story about a recent ward line meeting, using inside terminology and making an off-the-cuff joke that made Ethan burst into genuine laughter, the loud, unguarded sound he hadn't made with me in months. It was a shared language, a secret history being flaunted right over my heirloom silverware. Then came the moment that sliced through the pretense like a surgeon's scalpel. Lena needed a fork for her salad, and before I could even pivot toward the utensil drawer, she reached out, pulled open the third drawer down on the right side of the stove island, and retrieved a clean fork. She didn't hesitate. She knew exactly where the stainless steel was. I had designed those drawers. I had organized them the day we moved in. An assistant who had been kicked out of her apartment would ask, or at least fumble slightly. Lena acted like she was grabbing a fork in her own kitchen. Ethan saw the look on my face, the sudden stillness, the way my knife hovered over my plate, and he jumped in immediately, his voice sharp with manufactured irritation. "Hannah, are you really doing this?" he asked, waving his hand dismissively. "You're being hypersensitive. It's just a fork. For God's sake, do we have to have drama every time a new person walks into your life? You're starting to sound like a character out of one of those silly drama shows you watch." He was gaslighting me, pushing me into the stereotype of the hysterical, jealous wife so he wouldn't have to acknowledge the naked truth sitting 3 feet away. I swallowed the lump in my throat, the bitter bile of the unspoken betrayal. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I simply nodded once, a gesture of temporary surrender that he mistook for complete capitulation. "Fine," I thought, forcing myself to take another bite of the cold chicken. "You want me to be quiet? I can be quiet." Later that night, the rain still drumming against the window pane, I lay in the vast, cold expanse of our shared bed. Ethan was in the ensuite bathroom, supposedly taking a long shower to wash off the day. But the silence from the shower was punctuated by a continuous, insidious vibration, the rhythmic buzz, buzz, buzz of his phone lying on the marble counter, notifications piling up. I closed my eyes, trying to focus on the sound of the rain, but my architect's brain, always seeking clarity and pattern, pulled me toward the sound. I waited until the rhythmic vibrations started again, then quietly slid out of bed. My bare feet made no sound on the imported Italian tile I'd selected myself. The bathroom door was slightly ajar. I didn't step in. I just leaned close enough to see the glow emanating from the screen. The name illuminated on the lock screen wasn't a client, a banker, or a male friend. It was simply the letter L. The messages flickering up the screen were short, intimate, and devastatingly clear. "Can't wait until tomorrow. Wish I didn't have to leave the room. I told H I forgot my charger, just in case." They weren't notes between a boss and an assistant. They were the coded whispers of lovers. I didn't storm in. I didn't grab the phone and smash it against the wall. That would have been the drama Ethan expected, the predictable, emotional outburst that would have made me look like the problem. It would have meant destroying something I paid for, in a fit of rage he would use against me. Instead, I took a single, deep breath, tasting the sterile scent of the high-end soap I'd chosen for him, and backed away slowly. I climbed back into bed, pulling the duvet up to my chin, and stared at the custom-milled white ceiling, the one I had sketched on graph paper late one night, imagining our future beneath it. I whispered to the ceiling, to the quiet geometry of the room, to the woman I used to be. If you think this is your house, Ethan, you haven't understood who holds the final blueprint. The game was no longer about love or anger. It was about design, ownership, and consequences. And I was the one who knew every stress point in the foundation. The silence after Ethan's phone stopped buzzing was heavy and profound. The kind of silence that doesn't mean peace, but means the war has truly begun. Lying there, listening to the ocean sound machine I'd installed for him, I wasn't thinking about Lena, the girl currently breathing our air. I was tracing the fault lines that ran beneath this expensive, beautiful house, realizing they didn't start tonight. They started 3 years ago, maybe even longer. I met Ethan in a sterile, glass-walled conference room in the heart of the city. I was a young architect, barely 26, with my first big independent contract, redesigning the executive floors of one of Wardline Holdings' downtown office towers. The project was prestigious, but my status was clear. I was the hired help. Ethan, then 27, was supposed to be the client liaison, a figurehead role that required him to smile, approve budgets, and generally stay out of the way. He was the charming, slightly rebellious rich kid, seemingly detached from the heavy gravity of his father's billions. He didn't talk about quarterly earnings or mergers. He talked about texture, light, and how much he hated the stuffy bronze his father preferred. He looked at my portfolio, my passion for blending classic structure with minimalist comfort, and his gaze wasn't dismissive. It was admiring. "You're wasted on office lobbies, Hannah," he told me once over lukewarm coffee, leaning in conspiratorially. "You should be building dreams, not cubicles." He quickly morphed into the man I desperately needed him to be, the one who noticed the small details, the long hours I put in, the way my hands were always stained with charcoal from sketching. I was a woman determined to rise on merit, navigating a city built on connections I didn't have. Ethan provided the connection, but he wrapped it in the promise of emotional support. "I'll be your anchor," he'd promised, his voice low and compelling during a late night spent poring over blueprints. "I'll be the one person who always advocates for you, even when the whole world doubts you." It was a powerful message to a young woman who had always had to fight to be taken seriously. I mistook his privileged confidence for genuine belief in me. I fell for the idea that he saw me, not just the potential asset I could be to his perfectly curated life. When he proposed, Richard Ward's presence immediately shifted the atmosphere. The old man, a titan of leveraged buyouts and real estate, was correct, even ceremonious. He insisted on a prenuptial agreement, which Ethan waved away with a nonchalance that should have set off alarms. "It's just protocol, Han," Ethan insisted, using his pet name, stroking my hair. "Dad requires it. Standard stuff for the Ward name. Don't even bother reading the small print. It's all boilerplate legal jargon. It means nothing to us." Believing in the grand, sweeping narrative of our love story, that we were different, that our connection transcended their money, I signed it. I focused on the pages that detailed my minimal claim on Wardline's vast, multi-billion-dollar fortune. But a single, cold, crystalline phrase had snagged my attention. A brief detour from the financial minutiae. Should Party B, Ethan Ward, engage in public misconduct, including but not limited to open infidelity or financial malfeasance affecting shared marital assets, Party A, Hannah Hall, retains disproportionate legal advantage in dissolution proceedings. It was such a specific, harsh clause. I remembered thinking, why is Richard protecting me from his own son? The thought was jarring, but I tucked it away, convincing myself it was merely a relic of some past family drama. A morbid formality. I trusted Ethan, so I trusted the contract wouldn't matter. For 3 years, my role was invisible scaffolding. While Ethan was flying off to Beijing or London to bring the Wardline future, I was the one managing the mundane, ensuring the machine of our shared life ran smoothly and quietly. I paid the bills, the utilities, the property taxes, the mortgage. Even though he insisted he covered the principal, I managed the schedule. I dealt with the broken heating system and the leaking roof. I transformed this house from his bachelor pad, which he truthfully referred to as just a place to crash, into a home, a sanctuary. But to the Ward family, my work was always dismissed. When I won an award for the house's coastal renovation design, his mother, the formidable Evelyn Ward, raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Oh, the decorating thing," she said with a bright, patronizing smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's so lovely that you have a hobby, dear. While Ethan is out there genuinely building the future of the multi-billion-dollar corporation, someone has to manage the aesthetics." The lack of respect was a chronic, low-grade fever in our marriage. Ethan never defended me. He just laughed it off. "Don't worry about Mom. Hon, you know how she is. Just let it go." So, I learned to let it go. I internalized the insult, turning myself into the person they expected, the quiet, agreeable, well-behaved daughter-in-law. Inside, however, I was compiling a silent, comprehensive ledger of every slight, every moment of disrespect. Every time my existence was reduced to just a hobby. This wasn't anger, it was data collection. There was the sting of my studio launch. After 2 years of planning, securing a massive bank loan, and pouring every ounce of my expertise into my first commercial space, the launch party was my moment. Ethan was supposed to give a toast. Instead, I got a text 30 minutes before the doors opened. "Team emergency in Singapore. So sorry. Honey, go crush it." The team was always more important. And now, the team had a face, Lena's face. Then there was the cut that left the deepest scar, delivered by Evelyn at a charity gala, disguised as motherly concern. After watching me politely navigate a conversation with a tedious hedge fund manager for 15 minutes, Evelyn pulled me aside. "You are a charming girl, Hannah," she'd whispered, her voice like cut crystal. "But my son, well, he deserves a wife who operates at a different altitude, someone with a lineage, or perhaps just a deeper understanding of the tens of millions he handles. Don't you agree?" I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just smiled, sipped my champagne, and became another data point in my growing internal database. Looking back now, Lena walking in with her oversized luggage wasn't a random, sudden mistake. It was the predictable, arrogant result of Ethan's long-held belief that I was disposable, that my quiet nature equated to endless tolerance. He believed I was so grateful for his name and his money that I would simply endure anything to stay in this gilded cage. He, and the entire Ward family, had mistaken my silence for weakness. They mistook my ability to make a house beautiful for an inability to see the ugly structural damage in our foundation. And as I lay awake, the rain now just a soft hiss, the knowledge that Lena was sleeping somewhere nearby, maybe even already in the guest room I designed to be a peaceful retreat. I understood the game had escalated. If I did nothing, their collective contempt would continue, secure in the knowledge that I would forever remain the quiet, agreeable woman who just let things go. That was the moment the quiet woman disappeared. The architect, the one who rebuilt everything from the ground up, took her place, and this time, I wasn't designing for comfort, I was designing for collapse. The initial arrangement of a couple of weeks didn't just expire, it stretched, elastic and grotesque, becoming a fixture of our domestic landscape. Soon, Lena was no longer an inconvenience, she was an infection. The timeline of my descent into the status of cohabiting roommate was marked not by calendar dates, but by subtle shifts in real estate within my own home. First, it was a few sleek black shirts left hanging in the guest closet, then a full arsenal of designer cosmetics colonizing the shelf space in the guest bathroom, then, one Tuesday morning, I found a pristine line of Lena's ridiculously high stilettos arranged perfectly next to my favorite, scuffed working boots by the front door, a visual power play that made my stomach churn. She had established her permanent territory. Ethan began integrating her into our social sphere with a kind of casual cruelty. We'd attend a cocktail party thrown by one of his ward-line colleagues, and he would introduce Lena not as a temporary guest or executive assistant, but as a close family friend, or someone who is practically living with us now. The ambiguity was a calculated weapon. Our friends, mostly people I'd cultivated a relationship with over 3 years, would try to catch my eye, a flicker of pity or apology in their gaze, but their mouths remained sealed. No one would ever risk offending Richard Ward's heir over a matter of domestic ethics. Their silence was the most deafening part of the betrayal. It meant they were waiting for me to break so they could comfortably categorize me as the scorned, noisy ex-wife. The breaking point was not a shouted argument. It was a quiet Tuesday evening that felt staged. I was supposedly working in my downstairs studio, finalizing designs for a major client, when I heard low laughter followed by the telltale creak of our old leather armchair in the living room. I walked out slowly, pretending to be reaching for a glass of water. They were seated impossibly close on the charcoal gray sofa I had chosen for its clean lines. Ethan's hand was resting casually on Lena's knee as they scrolled through something on her phone. It was the relaxed intimacy of a couple unwinding after a long day, completely unconcerned about the third person supposedly sharing the space. They both froze, caught in the sudden beam of my presence, like deer in headlights. The pause lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then, with a sickeningly smooth recovery, Ethan lifted his hand, cleared his throat, and said, "Relax, Hannah. We were just looking at some market data for the San Francisco launch. You're always imagining things." He didn't remove his body language. He just removed the evidence, the denial, thrown out with such easy contempt, only fueled the fire in my gut. He treated the very air I breathed as evidence of my paranoia. But Lena was becoming bolder, moving from passive infiltration to active control. She started suggesting adjustments to my house, criticizing the aesthetic choices I'd been lauded for. "Ethan and I were talking," she announced one morning at breakfast, buttering a piece of toast with the self-assurance of a hostess. "The lighting in the living room really isn't ideal for his early morning Zoom calls. It makes the space look too soft. Maybe you should look at replacing those pendants? Something sharper, more professional." She was suggesting that the heart of my home, designed for warmth and coastal tranquility, be retrofitted into a corporate staging ground for her and Ethan's partnership. She spoke as if I were a hired contractor who had missed a key specification. The true explosion came the following Saturday, triggered by something ridiculously mundane: a missing cable. Ethan needed a specific charger for an old tablet and, of course, blamed me for misplacing it. The argument escalated quickly, fueled by months of suppressed resentment. I finally lost my cool, not by yelling about Lena, but by yelling about the sheer, arrogant disrespect. "You brought a woman into our home, and now you're blaming me for your disorganized life?" I snapped, my voice dangerously steady. "I manage everything in this house. The least you could do is acknowledge that I'm still your wife, not your long-suffering maid." That's when he delivered the killing blow, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy baritone that chilled me to the bone. "If you find it so uncomfortable, Hannah, you can go stay with your parents for a few days. I pay the mortgage on this place. I decide who stays. End of discussion." The world tilted. "I pay the mortgage." That phrase wasn't just cruel. It was a bald assertion of power based purely on capital. I vividly remembered that the title deed had my name on it, legally granting us joint ownership, but in Ethan's mind, because his money, Ward money, had financed the majority of the down payment and the monthly amortization, the house was unilaterally his. My architectural labor, the thousands of hours I spent rebuilding it, the emotional investment I poured into the foundation, meant absolutely nothing to him. It was the ultimate reminder that in the Ward universe, merit and sweat were irrelevant compared to the sheer volume of their bank account. Later that night, around 2 o'clock in the morning, the silence was broken again. I was restless, sitting up in bed, nursing a glass of water, when I saw the shadow move past the door. It was Lena, emerging from Ethan's ensuite bathroom, the one attached to our bedroom. Her hair was tousled, her face looked freshly scrubbed, and she was wearing one of Ethan's oversized soft cotton t-shirts, a gray one I'd specifically bought him last Christmas. The look we exchanged was not one of surprise. It was a theatrical confrontation. We stood there, frozen, the wife and the mistress, separated by the hallway, illuminated by the pale moonlight filtering through the plantation shutters I had sourced. Lena didn't apologize. She didn't look ashamed. She simply offered that confident, slightly irritating smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Oh," she drawled, her voice a soft, practiced whisper. "I thought you were asleep." The implicit meaning was clear. If you were asleep, I wouldn't have bothered to be discreet. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't even drop the glass. I just maintained the gaze until the smile finally, momentarily, faltered on her face. Then I turned and walked toward the bedroom, finding Ethan already back under the covers, pretending to be asleep. I leaned over him, forcing him to open his eyes. His gaze was guarded, defiant. "Have you thought carefully about what you're turning this house into, Ethan?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, yet vibrating with more force than any shout. He rolled away from me, pulling the duvet tighter, sealing himself off. His answer was cold, final, and entirely devoid of conscience. "I'm living the way I want to live. If you can't handle it, I'm not holding you back." That was the trigger. That sentence, "I'm not holding you back," was the activation switch for my escape plan. If he wasn't going to fight for the marriage, I wouldn't fight for the title of compliant wife. My revenge wouldn't be dramatic, messy, or emotional. It would be architecturally sound. It would be factual, legal, and it would ensure that when he finally realized what he had lost, it wouldn't just be me. It would be the entire foundation of his privileged life. The shouting was over. The planning had begun. The morning after Lena's 2 a.m. exit from my bedroom's ensuite, I woke up feeling cold, clinical, and unnervingly calm. The emotional debris, the heartbreak, the rage, the humiliating sting of betrayal, was cordoned off, placed in a vault. All that remained was the architect, focused on structural failure analysis. Ethan had given me a choice: be held back by him, or walk away free. I chose freedom, but on my terms, with maximum consequence. My first act was to retrieve the prenuptial agreement from the safe deposit box. It was a thick, dry document, bound in a navy cover, smelling faintly of the bank vault. I sat at my drafting table, the same place where I designed light and life into spaces, and I meticulously photographed every page with my phone, focusing on the densely packed legal paragraphs I had once dismissed. My chosen ally was not a sympathetic friend or a family counselor. She was Monica Hale, a divorce lawyer who, in the high-stakes world of New York and Boston divorces, was known as the Silent Reaper. She handled the dissolution of assets for the ultra-wealthy, specializing in finding the hidden leverage in contracts signed under false pretenses. Her fee was substantial, $500 an hour, but I was playing with Richard Ward's rules, and only the best would suffice. Monica's office was minimalist and intimidating, overlooking the harbor. I placed the flash drive containing the contract images and my initial notes on her clean glass desk. She didn't speak for the 10 minutes it took her to scroll through the clauses. When she finally looked up, her expression wasn't pity, it was professional astonishment. "Mrs. Ward," Monica said, leaning back in her Italian leather chair, "did you realize this agreement protects you far more than it protects him?" I confessed my memory of the infidelity clause. Monica nodded slowly. "That's just the tripwire. Look at this rider. Section 6, subsection C," she pointed to the screen. "It stipulates a severe decrease in spousal maintenance for Ethan, should he be the party proven to have engaged in overt, documented infidelity, causing the dissolution. It also guarantees you retention of the marital home, free of equity claim from him, and awards you a significant percentage of any non-vested stock options he currently holds in Wardline." She paused, letting the weight of the clauses settle. Most interestingly, these clauses are unusually harsh for an heir of his stature. They are written to protect the integrity of the Ward name from Ethan's own recklessness. I'd wager cold hard cash that Richard Ward, your father-in-law, inserted these provisions himself. He clearly didn't trust his own son to remain faithful. The realization hit me. Richard hadn't just been politely distant. He'd been strategically skeptical. He had created the blueprint for his son's destruction, and now I was holding the key. Monica explained the mission. We needed airtight proof of overt public and financial betrayal. We couldn't rely on rumor or vague accusations. My collection phase began immediately, transforming me into a highly specialized intelligence operative in my own home. I changed nothing outwardly. I still cooked, making sure Ethan and Lena had perfectly edible, if bland, meals. I still kept my schedule, still accepted Lena's polite, forced pleasantries. They saw the quiet, agreeable wife and assumed the storm had passed. They believed I had quietly accepted my diminished status. Their confidence was my greatest asset. They dropped their guard entirely. I worked in meticulous surgical strikes. The evidence poured in. Digital trail. I accessed our cloud backup, a system I set up, and downloaded months of Ethan's business emails. I found Lena's name tied to several hotel reservations during alleged business trips, booked through Ethan's personal card. Visual confirmation. The house had a pre-existing security camera system, installed after a petty theft 2 years ago. I pulled the footage from the interior cameras, meant to monitor the nanny we never hired, showing Lena and Ethan kissing intimately in the kitchen at 3 p.m. on a weekday, and later, footage of her confidently entering and exiting the primary bedroom in his clothing. The paper. The most satisfying find came during a routine clean of Ethan's home office, a space he rarely let me touch, tucked into the inner pocket of a suit jacket he was sending to the dry cleaners. I found a crumpled restaurant receipt and a small, coded note. The note detailed meeting locations and dates for meetings that matched the hotel reservations. I cross-referenced all of this data and began constructing a single, massive document, the timeline. It wasn't an emotional diary. It was a dispassionate chronology. June 14th. Ethan stated absence for Singapore trip. Email proof. June 14th. Lena booked a suite at the Carlton. Receipt. June 15th. Ada Cow, P. Video footage shows Ethan and Lena sharing wine on the deck. It was devastating in its objectivity. Then came the financial bombshell. While reviewing our jointly held checking account, the one I primarily managed, I noticed a large wire transfer flagged simply as Project Capital. Following the routing number, I realized Ethan had been funneling a significant amount of money, over $70,000, from our joint reserves into a private LLC. A quick search revealed Lena was listed as a 40% partner and CEO of the startup. This wasn't just infidelity. It was a clear violation of the contract's financial malfeasance clause. Ethan was using marital funds to finance his mistress's side business, completely bypassing my knowledge or consent. It was the legal lever we needed to trigger the harshest penalties in the prenup. When I presented the finalized timeline and the financial ledger to Monica, her eyebrows rose higher than they had for the contract itself. "We are no longer discussing a divorce, Hannah," Monica stated, her voice sharp with admiration. "We are discussing a total financial and reputational restructuring. You have 2 clear options. Option 1, we file now, you leave quietly, take the house, and your settlement as stipulated. You walk away with your dignity and a comfortable cushion. Option 2, we let them continue their arrogance. We let them dig their hole deeper, and then we flip the entire board." I looked out at the city, at the towering ward-line structures dominating the skyline. Structures Ethan had inherited, and I had merely decorated. "Option 2, I replied, the word feeling cold and clean on my tongue. "If he thinks he can play house in mine and steal from my life, I want him to understand the true cost of his choices." The final piece of the strategy, Monica agreed, had to involve the ultimate decision-maker. The man who drafted the weapon now in my hands. The idea was insane. The definition of walking into the lion's den, but it was the only way to ensure the system, the Ward system, would enforce the consequences. I had to contact Richard Ward. I had to make the ultimate predator my co-conspirator. As Ethan and Lena toasted their perceived victory downstairs, I typed an email to the billionaire. Simple and direct, my fingers flying over the keyboard. The time for silent suffering was over. The time for strategic alignment had begun. The email I sent to Richard Ward was a masterpiece of restraint. It contained exactly 2 sentences and attached 3 photographs. Close-ups of the most punitive clauses of the prenuptial agreement, specifically those pertaining to public infidelity and the misuse of marital assets. I didn't use the words cheating, mistress, or betrayal. I simply wrote, Mr. Ward, I need to discuss the genesis of a few specific covenants in the premarital contract I signed 3 years ago. I require clarification on the intent behind these terms. I expected the usual corporate delay, a reply from his executive assistant, requesting an abstract or offering a slot 3 weeks from now. Instead, the phone rang 30 minutes later. The caller ID simply read, Wardline Holdings. Hannah, this is Richard. The voice on the other end was deep, gravelly, and instantly commanding, cutting through any surrounding noise. Don't talk to anyone. Come to my office. Now. The top floor. The Wardline Tower was a temple of commerce, shimmering steel and glass soaring 52 stories above the city. The top floor was Richard Ward's personal sanctuary. Silent, austere, and furnished in heavy dark wood and minimalist leather, the view was overwhelming, presenting the entire financial world as his personal property. Richard was waiting for me at a long mahogany table, not his desk. He looked less like a corporate titan and more like an old Roman emperor, tired, calculating, and accustomed to total control. He didn't offer me coffee or small talk. Sit, he commanded, gesturing to the chair. His eyes, the color of cold, pale smoke, scrutinized me. Why now, Hannah? You've been living with this for months. Ethan tells me things are merely complicated. Why did you choose this moment to review the paperwork? His opening gambit was a test, a probe for emotion, for weakness, for the expected hysterical confession. He wanted to know if I was here as a distraught wife seeking pity or a mercenary seeking profit. I met his gaze steadily, refusing to cry, refused to plead. I slid a sleek, custom-printed portfolio, the one containing the airtight, chronological evidence assembled by Monica and me, across the table. I didn't come here to tell you your son is cheating. Mr. Ward, I'm here because your son is about to enact significant financial and legal damage to himself. And I want to understand who built the failsafe, I said, my voice measured and professional. I opened the portfolio to the financial ledger, showing the unauthorized $70,000 wire transfer from our joint account to Lena's LLC. I'm here to ask you, sir, I stated, resting my hand on the page detailing the infidelity clause. Who wrote this contract, and why were the terms so explicitly designed to strip Ethan of his assets in the event of documented moral failure? Richard didn't even pick up the file. His eyes fell on the logo printed at the bottom of the document. The discreet, stylized emblem of the high-powered law firm he utilized for his most sensitive estate planning, the firm Ethan hadn't even known about. A flicker, a complex, agonizing expression, crossed Richard's face before it snapped back into its customary mask of iron control. He knew instantly those clauses were his handwriting, his fear translated into legal code. He slowly reached for the binder and began flipping through my evidence. The security footage screenshots, the hotel receipts, the timeline of disrespect, the financial misuse. For 5 minutes, the only sound in that 52nd floor office was the soft rustle of paper. When he finished, he didn't address the current situation. He went back decades, offering the first real glimpse into the man beneath the billion-dollar veneer. You're not the first young woman to sit in front of me with evidence of my son's carelessness, Richard confessed, his voice surprisingly soft, a whisper against the window's silent view of the world. When I was much younger, about Ethan's age, I committed an infidelity. It devastated his mother. It nearly cost me Wardline entirely, a very foolish relationship with someone who thought she could bleed me dry. I learned the hard way that when the money is big enough, Betrayal is inevitable, unless the consequences are apocalyptic. He looked up at me, his eyes now conveying a shared understanding, not just a scrutiny. I didn't trust Ethan to handle temptation. Hannah, I knew he was spoiled, but I wanted him to keep the marriage intact, if only for the sake of the family's public image. I wanted the contract to be his deterrent. I wrote those terms myself. The penalties for infidelity and financial malfeasance, they are extreme. I thought you were a gold digger then. Frankly, I thought you'd see the terms and exploit them. Now I see I was wrong about one thing. He tapped a manicured finger on the ledger detailing Ethan's theft from our shared account. I thought the opportunist would be you. It turns out, the architect of this family's shame is the boy I raised. I didn't press the advantage. I kept my voice low, my demand simple. I don't want your money, Mr. Ward, I stated, pushing the portfolio back toward him. I don't want an elevated settlement. I just want to leave this marriage with my dignity intact, and without being made the public joke of the Ward family. I need Ethan to understand the boundaries he destroyed, and I need the freedom to walk away clean. Richard leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his chest, his expression shifting from acknowledgement to pure strategy. The air in the room suddenly grew colder, more focused. If all you want is freedom, Hannah, Richard said, the smoke-colored eyes piercing mine, I can give you far more than that. Your freedom is a given. You've earned it with this file. He paused, a dark, calculated smile playing on his lips. But I want my son to understand what true loss feels like. I want him to know that when he trashed the one good thing in his life, he didn't just lose a wife. He lost the structure of his entire future. And if you agree to this, I have a plan to deliver that consequence. The unexpected shift in dynamics, the sudden, terrifying proposal of alliance, made my heart hammer against my ribs. I had expected a settlement, maybe a handshake. I had received a proposition for a coup. I was no longer an injured wife. I was a strategic piece on Richard Ward's massive chessboard, and the move he was suggesting was checkmate. Richard Ward's office no longer felt like a place of confrontation. It felt like a war room. The proposition he laid out before me was not merely a divorce strategy. It was a hostile takeover of Ethan's perceived future. He rolled out a complex diagram on his touchscreen table, a network of nested companies, trusts, and holding structures that comprised Wardline Holdings, worth many billions of dollars. Look closely at this, Richard instructed, tapping a section that represented Ethan's current holdings. My son technically holds 30% of the non-voting stock and is the designated heir to the majority of the voting rights. However, he doesn't own it outright. It's held in a generation-skipping trust. Ethan only has custodial power over the shares on behalf of the family's stability. Should he violate certain clauses, specifically those relating to moral character and fiduciary responsibility, outlined in this appendix that only the tax lawyers read, I, as the grantor, have the unilateral, irrevocable right to pull the voting rights entirely. He explained that the moral character clause was the very one he had feared he would violate decades ago, the ultimate sword of Damocles hanging over the heir's head. Ethan's current actions, the public infidelity and the misuse of company assets, which Richard could easily prove were allocated for his managerial discretion, not personal entrepreneurial ventures with a third party, fell squarely under that violation. Then came the true proposal, the maneuver that would rewrite the script before Ethan even finished the first act of his life. My intention is this. If you cooperate, I will establish a new irrevocable trust. We will name it the Wardline Trust for Ethical Governance and funnel those voting rights, representing a controlling stake, into it. The sole trustee will be you, Hannah, in your capacity as the managing partner of a new philanthropic foundation we will establish together. I stared at the diagram, the names and percentages swimming before my eyes. This wasn't just taking away Ethan's money. This was pulling the chair out from under his entire identity. He would lose his voice in the boardroom, the only place he ever truly felt like a man. He would become a silent shareholder, financially comfortable, but politically powerless within the empire he believed was his birthright. The magnitude of the retribution made me hesitate. This was no longer about personal injury, it was about the destruction of a legacy. "Mr. Ward," I said, my voice barely steady, "this is immense. I want fairness. I want freedom. I don't want to be responsible for destroying your son's life." Richard's gaze hardened, losing the brief flicker of familial regret. "I am not trying to destroy him. I am trying to educate him on the true value of what he has so recklessly thrown away. He thinks everything is disposable, including his commitments and the people who uphold them. If he grovels, if he truly apologizes, if he genuinely makes amends for the betrayal and the theft, I still have a path for him to recover some of this. But if he continues to humiliate you, and by extension, the Ward name, in the very house you built, then he chooses his own oblivion." The choice was framed not as revenge, but as corporate cleanup, a legal consequence for a moral failure. We finalized the operational plan, the public setting for the confrontation. Richard would host a large, formal family dinner at our house, the house Ethan, Lena, and I were currently sharing. Ethan would be told it was a celebratory event, perhaps a soft launch for Richard to announce a new acquisition or a restructuring, something that would make Ethan feel important and secure. He would be completely blind to the fact that he was walking into his own non-jury trial. In the interim, my facade had to be flawless. I was to continue my role as the accepting, perhaps slightly defeated, wife. I even had to escalate my perceived surrender. I started being overtly polite to Lena, complimenting her on an outfit or asking genuinely about her startup plans. The effect was instantaneous. Ethan completely relaxed. He saw my courtesy as capitulation, proof that I had finally accepted the new normal and would file for a quiet divorce after all. They became brazen, often holding hands in the kitchen, confident that the meek little wife was finally out of their hair. Their arrogance was making my job easier, and every careless conversation or shared joke was another nail in Ethan's coffin. Behind the scenes, the machinery was moving with ruthless efficiency. Richard's personal counsel was secretly coordinating with Monica Hale. Documents were being drawn up and refined. The divorce petition citing the financial malfeasance clause, the detailed asset separation agreement, the intricate legal documentation for the formation of the new trust, and draft press releases for the Wardline board regarding the unexpected executive change if the news needed to be contained. Nothing was left to chance. Every scenario was accounted for. Outwardly, the only change Ethan was too preoccupied to notice was Richard's increased attention toward me. Richard started calling me directly, not just with boilerplate inquiries about his son, but genuinely asking about my design projects, my studio's progress, and my vision for sustainable architecture. "I'm thinking of putting you on the committee for the new downtown environmental project, Hannah," he suggested during one call. "I want to see if your vision is as structurally sound as your quiet demeanor suggests." It was a test, a final evaluation of my competence and my character. He wasn't giving me power out of pity. He was giving it to the person he believed was demonstrably better suited to wield it. I passed the test. Of course, I talked about budgets, timelines, and municipal codes, not fabric swatches. I spoke the language of structure and feasibility. As the day of the dinner approached, I was simultaneously the docile wife preparing a lavish meal for the family and the secret power broker about to execute the most complex architectural demolition of my career. I ironed the tablecloths, polished the silverware, and arranged the floral centerpiece, all while knowing that beneath the surface of this domestic tableau, a legal and financial time bomb was set, time to detonate at dessert. Ethan was convinced he was the master of his domain. He had no idea he was merely an unwitting participant in Richard Ward's final, devastating lesson. The evening was set, a family dinner, hosted in the house I designed. The house Ethan had turned into a theater of betrayal. Richard had insisted on this location, ensuring that the judgment would be delivered precisely where the moral violation occurred. The table was magnificent, my mahogany heirloom, polished to a high sheen, dressed in crisp linen, but the atmosphere was poisoned. Richard and his wife, Evelyn, were present, along with two of Ethan's cousins who held minor but influential positions at Wardline, and a pair of longtime family friends. Ethan, blissfully ignorant, was performing for his audience. He strolled through the living room with Lena on his arm, his fingers tightly laced with hers. He introduced her with exaggerated casualness. "This is Lena, my highly trusted executive assistant," he announced to his cousin, Mark, a man whose eyes were already darting nervously between me and Lena. The subtext was clear. "She's more than an assistant, and I'm daring you to say anything." Lena, wearing a dress that looked suspiciously like a size 0 version of one of my own designs, smiled the practiced, confident smile of a woman who believes she's already won. I moved through the scene with the practiced grace of a hostess. I smiled warmly, accepted compliments on the perfectly plated salmon, and played the part of the gracious, if slightly pale, wife. The pitying, worried glances from Ethan's cousin, Jessica, and a few of the older family friends were almost palpable. They saw a woman accepting her humiliation. A lamb led to the slaughter. None of them, not even Ethan, saw the lion in the linen apron. Throughout the main course, Ethan dominated the conversation. He waxed lyrical about his new startup, the one funded by money he stole from our joint account. He talked about Lena's incredible insight and how he was finally ready to carve out his own empire, independent of his father's old-fashioned oversight. "Wardline is too slow, Dad," Ethan declared, gesturing with his fork, a man drunk on his own confidence. "Lena and I are moving with agility. We're targeting a completely new market, a market that the older generation, no offense, just doesn't get." Richard Ward sat at the head of the table, silent, observing. He ate slowly, deliberately, never interrupting. He was the perfect passive listener, absorbing every detail of his son's reckless arrogance, every word Ethan spoke about his unauthorized project, about his use of Wardline connections and resources, and about his total disregard for the structure he was built on, was another piece of evidence confirming Richard's decision to cut him loose. I waited, my pulse a steady, metronomic beat against the rising tide of Ethan's self-congratulation. When the last crumbs of the flourless chocolate cake were cleared, and the scent of freshly brewed espresso filled the air, Richard finally spoke. He set his silverware down, not with a clatter, but with the quiet finality of a judge's gavel. He looked directly at Ethan, the pale smoke of his eyes cutting through the candlelight. "Ethan," Richard's voice was low, yet it commanded absolute silence. "You've discussed your future. I'd like to discuss the present. Are you entirely certain that you are being fair in your current conduct toward the only person at this table who truly calls this place home?" The question was deceptively mild, yet it brought the entire high-stakes dinner to a complete standstill. The air instantly evacuated from the room. Ethan, caught off guard, stumbled. He forced a dismissive laugh, trying to deflect the accusation. "Dad, don't start this. Hannah and I are working through our communication issues. She's just a little, unprepared for the modern reality of my life. She's not exactly what you'd call flexible about new people coming in, but we'll sort it out. I promise." Lena jumped in, her voice artificially sweet, attempting to validate Ethan's narrative. "It's just an adjustment. Mr. Ward, Hannah is an old-school designer. I just bring a more, forward-thinking perspective to Ethan's workspace." The implication was clear. I was the antiquated object, and she was the shiny new upgrade. Richard ignored Lena completely. He looked past her, maintaining his focus on me. "Hannah," he said, his tone shifting from paternal query to public instruction, "if you feel you are ready, I believe now would be an appropriate time to present the documents you shared with me earlier this week." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning unit outside the dining room. Ethan's mouth dropped open. Lena's confident smile vanished, replaced by a sudden frantic confusion. I stood up, pushing my chair back slowly, and walked to the sideboard. I retrieved my slim laptop. connecting it to the large, wall-mounted display I usually used for presenting design concepts to clients. I opened the file and the first image flashed onto the screen. A screenshot of the Wardline joint bank account ledger, highlighting the wire transfer labeled Project Capital and the exact amount, over $70,000, stolen from our marital reserves. I clicked to the next slide, a clean, bold title reading, Timeline of Financial and Moral Malfeasance. The next slides were a relentless, clinical march of destruction. June 14th, 18th. Wire transfer of funds to Lina's LLC, violating prenuptial clause B. June 15th, 3:07 p.m. Security camera footage, kitchen. Image of Ethan and Lina kissing passionately next to the marble island. June 16th, 2:03 a.s. Security camera footage, hallway. Image of Lina exiting the primary bedroom, wearing Ethan's t-shirt. July 2nd, hotel booking receipt. Ethan Ward's credit card. Booking 2 adults in a suite in Miami for a Wardline solo scouting trip. The family watched in horrified silence. Ethan was rigid, his face draining of color, unable to reconcile the meek wife he thought he had tamed with the architect of this brutal public expose. Lina looked utterly terrified, finally realizing that her status as assistant had never offered her legal protection. I advanced to the final slide, which displayed a screenshot of a text message Ethan had carelessly sent to a friend a few days earlier, pulled from the cloud backup. The words, projected 3 feet high, were the final, definitive dagger. She, Hannah, isn't going anywhere. This house, this money, it's all mine. She's too timid to fight. I closed the laptop, the screen going instantly dark. The dining room was plunged into a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on everyone. Ethan's jaw was working, but no words came out. I finally looked at him, and for the first time in 3 years, he saw me. Not the reflection of his status, but the formidable, cold intelligence he had consistently underestimated. I didn't fight, Ethan, I said, my voice cutting through the tension. I simply presented the facts, and those facts prove you have officially violated every ethical and financial clause designed to protect the Wardline name. Now, your father has something to say about your inheritance. I stepped back, yielding the floor to Richard. The game was over. The verdict was about to be delivered. The moment I closed the laptop, the sudden darkness of the screen amplified the horror of the exposed truth. Ethan didn't just look defeated. He looked physically shattered. He lunged forward, his chair scraping back violently, his eyes wild. He tried to grab the power cord to sever the connection, but it was too late. Everyone had seen the ledger, the kisses, and the final, arrogant text. His carefully constructed reality had imploded in front of a dozen witnesses. A collective intake of breath swept around the table. The family friends shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with Ethan. Cousin Mark stared at the empty screen with a horrified fascination, calculating the fallout. The disdain was clear, heavier than any physical blow. They weren't looking at a son. They were looking at an incompetent heir caught with his hand in the till. Lina, her face now the color of bleached parchment, started scrambling for cover. "I didn't know that was joint money," she pleaded, her voice high and thin, directed instantly at Richard. "Ethan told me it was capital from his discretionary fund. He implied Hannah was totally on board with us co-founding the project. I thought she had agreed to the separation of assets." Her quick, desperate defense, throwing Ethan completely under the bus, only served to further isolate him. Lina's words confirmed that Ethan was the mastermind, the primary liar who had misrepresented the nature of both the money and our marriage to her. He didn't just betray me, he had dragged his mistress into a legal quicksand based on his own lies. Richard, the silent judge, remained perfectly still. He didn't raise his voice, didn't slam his hand down. He simply looked at his son with an expression of profound, weary disappointment. "Ethan," Richard asked, the question ringing with ultimate authority, "do you deny the veracity of these images, these figures, and these communications?" For a fleeting second, Ethan opened his mouth, searching for a lie, an excuse, a diplomatic out. But the evidence was overwhelming. My timeline was impeccable, the numbers concrete, the betrayal filmed in high definition. In that brief moment, the spoiled boy finally understood he had run out of chances. He sank back into his chair, breathing heavily, shaking his head once in a silent, desolate acknowledgement. Richard then turned to me, his instruction clear. "Hannah, you've done the legal due diligence. Please read the portion of the prenuptial agreement regarding moral failure and the use of joint funds." I retrieved the contract printout I had brought, opening it to the exact page. My voice was steady, calm, the cool delivery of an expert witness simply relaying statute. Section 6, subsection C, states that the use of marital property for a personal business venture without consent, coupled with documented, overt infidelity, constitutes a severe breach of moral and fiduciary responsibility. I read, emphasizing the dry legal terminology. This allows Party A, myself, to dissolve the marriage with extreme legal advantage, including full retention of the marital home and certain stock options, to mitigate the damage caused to the family's stability. Ethan's gaze snapped from his father to me, and for the first time since Lena moved in, his expression wasn't angry or arrogant, it was raw, desperate supplication. "You can't do this to me, Hannah," he whispered, his voice cracking, truly begging now that he faced the real abyss. "I'll fix it. I'll make her leave tonight. I'll go to a therapist. I swear. Don't ruin my life. Please, don't destroy me." The urge to deliver a final, cathartic, screaming rejection was immense, but I pushed past it. I looked at the pathetic, pleading man who had so casually tossed me aside, and felt neither satisfaction nor hatred, but a calm, profound pity. "I am not ruining your life, Ethan," I replied, my voice perfectly level. "I am merely shining a light on the life you chose to live. I have lived in your shadow for 3 years of this, and I am done with the dark." As Ethan's world was crumbling, Lena, realizing she was sinking with the ship, made a final, chaotic attempt to save herself. She turned on Ethan, her voice spitting fire, revealing their own private conflicts and the extreme financial risks Ethan had taken on other secret ventures, confirming to Richard that his son was indeed an unreliable manager. It was a messy, loud disintegration that confirmed all of Richard's worst fears about his son's character. One of the family friends, Evelyn's cousin, tried to intervene, urging a quiet compromise. "Richard, please, this is too much. Let's handle this privately. Think of the ward name." Richard stopped him with a sharp, imperious wave of his hand. "No, no one protects the reputation of this family better than the truth, and the consequences it demands. If we cover up this kind of corruption and betrayal, we are no better than he is." The decision was mine, and I knew what I had to do to ensure my exit was clean, not just legally, but morally. I spoke, addressing the entire room, cutting through the shame and the panic. "I will be filing for divorce tomorrow, citing the contractual breach. I will accept the terms dictated by the prenuptial agreement. The marital home will transfer to me, along with the legally stipulated compensation." I paused, looking directly at Richard, letting him know I understood the deeper game. "However," I continued, ensuring my voice carried the maximum weight of my independence, "I do not require any further financial compensation from the Ward estate, nor will I pursue any claim on assets beyond those explicitly outlined and secured in the contract. I don't want your money. I only want the right to reclaim my life, free from this toxicity." It was the ultimate rejection. The woman they had accused of being a gold digger was walking away from an enormous fortune, proving that all she ever truly wanted was her freedom and her dignity. The shock in the room, particularly in Richard's eyes, was momentary but potent. Ethan's public downfall was complete, but my private victory was secured without 1 ounce of cruelty or greed. The cleanup after the family dinner was swift and brutal. Ethan didn't have the composure for strategy. He had the temper of a petulant child finally denied his favorite toy. He stormed into his study, slamming doors, pulling files from his cabinets and shouting obscenities into his phone. Lena, realizing her co-founder had just lost his funding and his influence, packed her things with cold efficiency, occasionally throwing back accusations at Ethan about his deception. I heard the smashing of a glass picture frame, the tearing of papers, and then the final, desperate squeal of tires as Ethan and Lena peeled out of the driveway into the rainy night. They left behind a trail of physical and emotional debris, overturned chairs, discarded legal pads, and the lingering scent of fear and failure. I didn't move for half an hour. When the front door finally clicked shut behind the last retreating relative, Cousin Jessica offering a muttered, horrified apology, Richard Ward was the only one left. He hadn't rushed out with the others. He sat in the large, comfortable armchair in the living room, the one I had designed to look out over the ocean, surrounded by the ghosts of the night's revelations. He looked like a king surveying a recently won, devastated battleground. He slowly looked around the room, taking in the perfection of the design, the warmth I had layered over Ethan's sterile existence, and the quiet dignity I maintained even after being publicly humiliated. He wasn't just evaluating the house, he was evaluating the people who had occupied it. "The papers are signed and witnessed," Richard said, his voice flat, devoid of triumph or regret. "My lawyers worked through the entire dinner. As of midnight tonight, the voting power tied to the family trust, the one Ethan believed was irrevocably his, is pulled. If you agree, Hannah, that power will be temporarily transferred to the new foundation, the one named for ethical governance, and you will hold the temporary seat as sole trustee." I was numb. This was the crazy proposal Richard had alluded to, and hearing it now, stripped of all legal jargon, it felt monstrous. "Ethan doesn't just lose the marriage. Hannah," he continued, rising slowly and walking to the window. "He loses his voice in the corporation. He becomes a bystander. You won't just walk away free. You will step directly on top of the carcass of his ambition." I was staggered by the sheer weight of the power being offered. It was greater than the house, greater than any financial settlement I could have wrung out of him, far more than the millions the contract entitled me to. This was the ability to influence the direction of a multi-billion-dollar global entity, the very empire that had dismissed me as just a decorator. My internal struggle was immediate and fierce. Could I, an architect of quiet spaces, wield this kind of corporate, cold power? If I accepted this immense control, wouldn't I be becoming the very thing I despised? A ruthless, calculating player in the Ward game? My revenge was supposed to be about truth and freedom, not about acquiring dominance. Richard seemed to read my ethical wrestling in the tense silence. He turned, his face etched with something heavier than cynicism, a deep, ancient regret. "I'm not asking you to become a predator, Hannah," he said, his voice dropping low. "But I will tell you something I've never told anyone else, not even Evelyn." He began to share the true history of the prenup, the one born from his own sin. He described his youthful betrayal, the devastating moment his wife, Ethan's mother, discovered his infidelity. He told me how she had nearly taken him for everything, but instead, out of a profound, cold love, she had chosen to forgive him publicly, but never truly trusted him again. She had spent the rest of their marriage watching him with a distant, chilling scrutiny, and that had created the clauses in the trust, the ones meant to punish moral weakness and protect the family name. That history, my failure, her cold forgiveness, is why the clauses exist. The shame of nearly losing everything shaped me into the monster I am today. I put those clauses in Ethan's contract because I was terrified he would repeat my catastrophic mistake, destroying the company and the family with a careless affair. He looked directly at me, his confession hanging heavy in the air. "I am not a good man, Hannah. My actions have always been driven by fear and control, but I know the difference between a person who is tearing this house down and a person who is desperately trying to hold it together. If you refuse this power, I will be forced to give it to someone else, perhaps one of the grasping cousins, or some corporate shark who cares nothing for the integrity of the firm, and that, I assure you, would be far worse for everyone Wardline employs and impacts. The realization hit me. My refusal to engage wasn't principled. It was cowardly. If I walked away now, Ethan would still lose his power due to the documented breach, but it would fall into the hands of the other hungry wolves circling the Ward fortune, the very relatives who had looked at me with such dismissive disdain just an hour ago. If I accepted, I could act as a firewall. I could ensure Wardline, under my temporary oversight, wouldn't become the kind of ruthless grinding machine that had so cavalierly crushed me and dismissed my value. I could safeguard the company's direction until Richard could find a stable, ethical replacement. The decision was no longer about revenge against Ethan. It was about responsibility and my capacity to do good with power I never asked for. I finally agreed, but I set my own terms, the architect rebuilding the agreement on a foundation of transparency. "I will accept, Mr. Ward," I said firmly, meeting his cold gaze with my newfound resolve. "But this must be documented as a temporary transitional transfer for the duration of your life. I will not be bound by your family forever. The paperwork must reflect that I retain the absolute right to sever all ties and walk away clean, selling off the trust's controlling rights to a vetted, external party, should I ever feel compelled to do so." Richard gave a slight, satisfied nod. It was the first time I had ever seen him genuinely impressed. "Fair enough. Hannah, you didn't ask for money. You asked for an escape route, and you've designed one with an escape hatch." I had entered the Ward world through a marriage of presumed love and inequality. I was leaving it with a guaranteed freedom and a terrifying temporary scepter of power, earned through quiet competence and documented truth. The final public act was yet to come, but the fate of Ethan Ward, and my own future, was sealed. A few weeks later, the atmosphere in the main executive auditorium of Wardline Holdings was cold, polished, and tense. This wasn't a family dinner. This was a tribunal of the financial elite. Every member of the executive board, the firm's top lawyers, and several critical family shareholders were present. Ethan was there, too. Summoned by his father, he walked in with Lena close behind, putting on a brittle, forced confidence. He'd spent the last weeks in denial, convinced that his father had merely staged the dinner spectacle to scare him straight and would, at the last minute, offer him a graceful corporate bailout, as he always had. He believed he was walking into a wrist slap, not a professional execution. Richard Ward stood at the podium. He looked weary but utterly in control. He began with a concise, unemotional statement. "Members of the board, shareholders, family, for too long, the private moral conduct of my immediate family has risked impacting the stability of this corporation. Today, we are correcting the legal and structural ownership to ensure integrity and long-term ethical governance of Wardline Holdings." The air crackled with anticipation. Richard gestured to his lead counsel, who stepped forward and began reading from the official document, the updated trust agreement. Due to documented and acknowledged breaches of the moral character and fiduciary responsibility clauses, as stipulated in the Ward Family Trust, the voting rights corresponding to Mr. Ethan Ward's custodial shareholding are hereby revoked, effective immediately. A collective gasp swept through the room, but the lawyer continued, the words dropping like stones into a well. "These controlling voting rights are hereby transferred to the Wardline Trust for Ethical Governance, established this month, and the sole independent trustee appointed to oversee these rights during this transitional period is Hannah Hall." The revelation hit Ethan like a physical blow. He shot out of his chair, the sound echoing through the silenced auditorium. "This is betrayal!" Ethan screamed, his voice breaking with fury. "This is a setup! You manipulated the contract! Hannah, you gold-digging witch! You stole everything! You framed me!" Lena, meanwhile, had her phone glued to her ear, furiously texting or calling an emergency contact, her eyes darting toward the exits. The reality was setting in. The money tap had been shut off, and her business partner was now powerless. Richard rose from his seat, not with rage, but with the cold, measured authority of a man settling a debt. He walked around the mahogany table and looked directly down at his son, forcing Ethan to meet his eyes. Richard's voice, though not raised, was amplified by the room's acoustics, ensuring every word was heard, recorded, and would be remembered. My son made a huge mistake when he assumed that loyalty was something you could trample on and still retain. He moved his paramour into the house of the only woman who had ever truly believed in him, the person who had dedicated 3 years of her life to upholding his. I do not reward that kind of calculated recklessness. Richard turned to me, his tone softening slightly, granting me the respect he had always withheld. You, Hannah, are not responsible for his collapse. He signed his own sentence the day he ushered his mistress into your marital home, using stolen funds to finance her company. That consequence is his alone. I did not celebrate, I did not gloat, and I did not return Ethan's accusations. I simply stood, calm and professional, the only structurally sound person in the room. I had no desire to destroy Ethan, I stated, addressing the room, ensuring my statement was one of separation, not malice. I simply wanted to decouple my life from the choices he made. The rest of this is merely the inevitable result of those choices. As the meeting dissolved into chaotic whispers, Ethan was surrounded by lawyers who began the painful process of informing him exactly how diminished his power now was. Lena, recognizing that the heir was now powerless, quietly slipped out the back door, disappearing from his life as quickly as she had arrived. I signed the final documents, the divorce decree, the trust papers, the non-disclosure agreements, finally, officially, ending my marriage and establishing my temporary unforeseen authority over Wardline. I was officially a single woman, armed with the single most important voice in the massive corporate structure. The final act was my return to the house. It was late, silent, and empty. I walked through the charcoal gray living room, where the betrayal had been filmed, and into the kitchen where Lena had so casually reached for a fork. There was no one's laughter, no strange scent of another woman's perfume, no sound of a phone vibrating in the bathroom. The chaos was gone. I placed my hand on the solid, cool wall of the house I had rebuilt. I stood in the silence, no longer needing Richard's approval or Ethan's love. All I needed was the autonomy I had finally secured. He thought bringing his mistress in here was the way to push me out of his life. It turns out, it was the only way to propel me toward the life I deserved, and as far away from him as possible. Thank you for listening to my story. Please comment below and tell me where you're listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to the Lila Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and hit the like button to help this story reach more people.